very delighted to have my next guest here on the We Don't Have Time TV, coming from the NOAA conference here in Zurich, where startups, investors, and others have come together for 2 days to try and see if they can, wed each other, you might say. It's like a marriage situation here, isn't it? Where they can come together and the finance can fund many of these solutions that we need for a more sustainable world. Very interesting here, of course, in Zurich, that sustainability and digitalization are very much part of this show. So I've got my next guest. If you could say who you are and who you're representing.
Sure. My name is Ralph Eric Kunz. I'm representing a company called Co-Investor Partners, a private equity investor in technology and other growth businesses.
Great. And what are you here showcasing at NOAA, Ralph?
So we're showcasing one of our investments, which is a company called Nextbike, which we talked before.
Yeah, we talked before. I live in Berlin and I use Nextbike. Yeah.
So they're Europe's market leader in bike sharing. And we've just sold this company to a large scooter sharing company, creating the largest player for micromobility. So we strongly believe that micromobility can actually have an impact in having less cars, i.e. less fossil fuels in cities. And that's the thing I'm showcasing here and trying to explain a little bit what is necessary for that to happen.
So then explain to our viewers, what is necessary? What's the missing link, you think, in this true sort of city mobility that's needed?
So a couple of things. Let's start with what has already happened. Number one, I used to work at Nokia, and at Nokia, we created maps and put maps on basically mobile devices. And we also have apps on mobile devices. And those are the two, let's say, necessary prerequisites for actually allowing people to rent something on the spot. And that's basically happening. And people, I think, that use case is well spread. Now, the issue is, it's not about renting something right now. It's about having availability at the end of your trip. So simple use case, it doesn't really help us that much if you live in the center of a city like Berlin and there's 10 scooter companies and 3 bike companies out there that can offer you a trip, because you probably own your bike yourself or you would walk. But to a certain extent, that use case doesn't really help. The use case, because it doesn't avoid car traffic. You're not you're not doing an inner city trip by car anyway, because there's sufficient public transportation. The use case we're basically trying to resolve is a use case where you live somewhere a little bit further outside. You have a mile to the subway stop. You would take the subway, maybe in the morning. But the issue is you want to be sure when you get back home that there's something waiting for you to take that last mile home. And that's the issue today, because even if I look up my app and I see there's a bicycle or a scooter next to the S-Bahn or subway stop there, I'm not sure that there's going to be one in 30 minutes when my subway arrives.
Yes.
And that's one of the issues. So one of the issues is actually rebalancing the amount of devices, the bikes, the scooters, in a way that's supplementary to public transportation. And there's a couple of steps necessary to get there.
Right. But I mean, these days you just see people with trucks going around and dropping bikes and things off in different places. But you're talking about something a bit more sophisticated than what they're doing now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things. One thing is what we call rebalancing. It's basically making sure that the bikes are where they're needed. And that's what is happening today. For example, Nextbike has city contracts with over 300 cities in which the cities pay exactly for that. They basically want to make sure, so-called service level agreements, that there are bikes where they're actually needed because they know the flow of public transportation. Usually when the cities do these contracts, it's actually the public transportation arms, branches of these cities that do these contracts because they see it as supplementary. So in many of these cities, you can actually, if you have a public transportation pass, you have a certain amount of minutes free with your bike. So that's the first step. That already helps. It helps basically make sure bikes are where they're needed and not necessarily where the people are. Because if this is an unsubsidized private system, where you're going to put your bikes or scooters, you're going to put them where there's most density, because that's where you make your money. The most density you have downtown. Now, downtown, you also have public transportation. So the public good, it doesn't really help that much. So one of the hypotheses we basically have is public transportation systems are in order for them to be effective, are usually subsidized. And I think the US shows if you don't subsidize them, you might have good public transportation during rush hour, but you don't have it as a public service. And I think we have to use that same methodology also for this new world of mixed mobility. And very little amount of euros or dollars can actually have a huge impact.
So in other words, what you're saying is that if we need to actually support the idea that basically if you're going to come in and commute by car, and you're not going to come into the city and pollute the air and things like that, or be stuck in traffic jams, and that has all kinds of other impacts. But you need to know that you can actually get a sustainable option at some point on the edge, or sort of, not right in the middle of the city, whether it be an e-scooter, an e-bike, or something like that, that can bring you in for that last kilometer, that last mile of your journey.
Exactly.
And it's reliable, and you know it's there when you're on the way back as well.
Exactly. So you book it in advance.
Yeah.
And that means you basically, I used to work in telecommunications, you need a system which is very similar to roaming in mobile phones. So when you come from your home country, Germany, and go to the UK, you today reliably know that your phone's going to work there because there's basically a interconnect agreement between these two operators. In a very similar way, we need sort of interconnect agreements between the operators of these different scooters or bikes or shared cars. In a way that you can, A, as we discussed, book them in advance, and B, there's also a payment system that interoperates. So you don't have 10 different payment systems, and you don't have to have 10 different accounts and 10 different apps in the end.
Got you. Okay, super. One last question. So in Glasgow at the UN Climate Conference, we were there as We Don't Have Time TV, broadcasting for 5 hours every night, and we decided at short notice to have a counter that showed the amount of money that the governments are spending on fossil fuel subsidies around the world, based on a new report from the International Monetary Fund. $11 million a minute, trillions and trillions of dollars a year. And we thought this seemed a little unfair, seeing as oil companies not really startups, and they're not really part of the future, but they seem to be holding it back a bit, or at least when we don't have a level playing field with all this money spent. We're now counting up again from since Glasgow, the government spent $581 billion on fossil fuel subsidies, all government. That could really do a lot for public transport if it was spent on solutions to
and I can tell you, you don't even need to spend it. The biggest issue for these types of companies is actually getting the funding to invest.
Yeah.
So, just imagine a public body in Germany would probably get a loan for close to zero, maybe 0.1%.
Yeah.
We have to privately get that money at 5, 6, 7%. So if the governments were basically willing to just give a guarantee for the investment, that wouldn't even be spending money. It would just basically using the spending power of government, to basically enable something that saves a lot of greenhouse gases.
Right. But at the same time, it might be useful to spend that money maybe on healthcare or something else.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Good, Ralph. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope it all works out here at NOAA, and best of luck and a safe journey back to Berlin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.